Good morning. Welcome to the Children's Museum of Atlanta's Town Square, a series designed for families, educators, and the community to learn about and discuss important issues and address some of the challenges that we have all faced over the past months. We are so fortunate as to be able to engage our best and brightest in these conversations that will hopefully enlighten, educate, and in some cases dispel any myths. If you missed past Town Square conversations, you can find them on our blog at our website, childrensmuseumatlanta.org, or on our YouTube channel. Again, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. The purpose of October's Coming Out Month is to recognize the impact that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals have had on history, locally, nationally, and internationally. To honor those contributions, we decided to have these important educational conversations this October. This week, I am delighted to introduce you to Ryan Roemerman, Director of Innovation and the Executive Director at the Lgbtq Institute at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, and Ashlei Rabess, an advisory board member of the Lgbtq Institute at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. We are fortunate to have such talented people here, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about them before we jump into the conversation. At the center, Ryan serves as the Director of Innovation and helps to refine the center's efforts to become a locally grounded but globally relevant voice on civil and human rights. Ryan is the creator and advisor of Safe School Certification, a technical assistance model that strengthens implementation of safe school laws and helps schools adopt best practices for sustaining safe, supportive, and equitable learning environments. The Safe School Certification is currently being piloted and studied in Washington, D.C. with funding from the National Institute of Justice, the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, the D.C. Office of Human Rights, and Child Trends. Previously, Ryan co-founded a nonprofit to help rural LGBTQ youth by providing them with leadership and social justice organizing opportunities. This work is instrumental in helping to pass a comprehensive safe schools and civil rights law to protect LGBTQ Iowans from discrimination. Ashlei Rabess is a licensed associate professional counselor and is in the third year of her doctoral program in counselor education and practice at Georgia State University. Ashlei's academic and professional interests include multiculturalism and social justice in counseling and counselor education, generational trauma and healing, internalized oppression in LGBTQ plus individuals, and group work. Ryan and Ashlei, I would love to start out by asking you both to talk a little bit about yourself, your work, and why you thought it was so important to be part of this conversation today.
I'll go ahead and start. Well, first of all, thank you for having me today, and to the Children's Museum and for all the work that you do throughout the year. Obviously, this is very important to me in terms of personally as an LGBTQ person, but also in terms of the work that I do. And October is, LGBTQ History Month, and it is important for especially young people to know their leaders that have come before them, so they understand their history. I think that's been very important, and something we've seen throughout the year here is the need for us to know our history.
Ashlei?
Yes, thank you again for having us today. I'm super excited to be part of this conversation. As a mental health professional, I understand the ramifications and the mental health challenges and effects that an unwelcoming society and unaffirming families and communities can have on individuals that identify within the LGBTQ community. And so it's important to me to be helping to contribute to a system in which we as individuals can live freely and happily and healthily with regard to our mental and physical health. So looking forward to talk more about ways that we can accomplish that.
Wonderful, thank you. So we're really here to talk about the landscape currently, legal landscape in particular, right now for LGBTQIA plus people. Can you talk about the work you are doing now as you survey that landscape and what you have learned? And especially what about federal and local laws related to schools?
Sure. So the LGBTQ Institute surveyed the South when we recognized a few years ago when we were trying to get the census complete that a lot of LGBTQ folks were being left out of that data. And so we decided to create our own Southern survey to really understand what is life like for LGBTQ Southerners. The full information of what we discovered is available at lgbtqsouthernsurvey.org, and you can take a look at the data that we found. But the clear takeaways of that, and I don't think it comes as a surprise to folks, is that people of color, people who are in more rural areas, these are folks, transgender folks, who are most stigmatized when it comes to policies and laws that are on the books. And we see that whether it be in education, in healthcare, for example, in healthcare, transgender folks, at least a third of them, didn't feel like they were being represented in the healthcare setting, to the point that nearly half decided just to not get care. So there's a lot of barriers that are set up in terms of policy. And so I think that we want to be able to change that. Our hope is that this Southern Survey data can allow nonprofits who do this work across the 14 states that we consider the South. So if you think about it, it's everything from Virginia, West Virginia, down to Florida, over to Oklahoma, Texas is what we consider the South. We surveyed these 14 states, and we worked with over 140 nonprofit partners to disseminate the survey. But the goal is to have these organizations use this data to really activate leaders and community members to change the laws and policies to ensure that everyone has equal access to education, healthcare, and these kinds of supports are very much greatly needed.
Wonderful. Ashlei, what have you noticed and observed in your work about the landscape?
Yes, this has been a challenging topic within the counseling profession specifically. So counseling is one of those professions that are governed at the state level. And so different states have different policies with regard to serving LGBTQ individuals. And recently, within the past couple of years, there have been 2 states, I think Tennessee, and I want to say West Virginia, that have allowed for counselors to basically terminate with a client with whom they have differing identities with regard to sexual orientation. And so we know that that is incredibly not aligned with our ethical principles at all. And there have been a lot of discord between our professional organizations and the state licensure boards. So we have a profession that's advocating for laws to be changed, for those harmful discriminatory laws to be changed. And then we have state boards that are on a whole different page. And so as counselors, we've been advocating for a different political landscape and a different legal landscape for with regard to counselors and their right to terminate clients. So that's kind of what it's looked like for the mental health profession. And a lot of the work that we do now is centered around that legislative work, making sure that folks who identify with an LGBTQ identity or with a disability status or something, anything like that, any differing identity, anything like that, can have equal access to care without concern about being terminated unjustly.
So I'm going to ask dig a little deeper on that. So if a counselor can just terminate someone, does that mean they lose that counselor? But if the counselor isn't treating them fair and equally, don't they want to lose that person? Don't they want to get somebody who's going to be more affirming?
Yes, right. So that's kind of the conundrum of it. I guess in thinking of folks with marginalized identities, obviously we don't want to force counselors to work with them, but I think what we talked about earlier of creating a culture of inclusivity, I think it's important that we establish laws that aren't discriminatory. And so obviously those individuals will have, in a perfect world, individuals can choose who their counselors are. I know with agency work and things like that, it can be a little sticky. But I think sending the message that counselors are not able to discriminate against clients for whatever identities they hold is of the utmost importance.
Agreed, totally agreed. So thanks for just unpacking that a little for me. And I also wanted to ask a question about that very recent Supreme Court decision has made a large difference in workplace rights for the community. What recent impacts have you seen, if any, based on that ruling?
So a lot of companies have championed LGBTQ rights over the past several decades, and they've been oftentimes filling the gap when states and the country itself has not created um, standard laws that make LGBTQ discrimination unacceptable. This law allows for LGBT folks not to be fired for being who they are. But I think it's important to note that while most companies, especially in the Fortune 500, have laws in the books and their own policies and practices that don't allow that, when it comes to other companies that maybe wouldn't normally have an explicit statement such as this, might find themselves in a situation where they're having to butt up against this law. And I think that it's more about implementation. So you can have the best law on the books, but it doesn't mean anything if it's not implemented with fidelity. And I think that's going to be the thing we're gonna have to watch over the next several years, is how much is this really being implemented with fidelity across the board. So I think it's still yet to be seen in terms of the implications of the long-term effects of the law.
Okay, that's important to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to mention that, even with companies that have these laws on the books, especially according to our Southern survey, when it comes to transgender folks in particular, they often feel like it's not enforced. So again, it's really about enforcement of these laws beyond just the letter.
So if you feel, is a transgender person or LB, is there a place you can go where if you feel like your workplace is not following the law?
Well, I mean, generally you would want to talk to folks in HR if you feel like you've been harassed or you've been discriminated against. But there's definitely a lot of national organizations that are available, and local chapters as well. For example, the ACLU and others, who could support you if you're starting to feel that even if you have went and exhausted these channels and they're still not listening, that you could find some extra support.
Right. And then another question is, how is the new landscape impacting young people? Kids from preschool up through high school, graduation, counseling, all the wraparounds. Can you both, Ashlei, do you want to jump in about students and counseling and services and what they can look for and find, or?
Right, I think we're in such a unique time. I think that kids nowadays have a lot more access to resources than maybe in previous generations. And so I kind of like to think of that as like a blessing and a curse. There's all these scary things that can be found online, but there are so many resources. Ryan and I have, and our team have compiled a list of resources that folks can use with regard to, we've talked about conversion therapy in the past and LGBTQ folks within the business world and that sort of thing. But across the board, it seems like there are a good number of organizations dedicated to the advancement and inclusion and fostering of health and mental health of LGBTQ folks. I think within the school system, it maybe looks a little bit different from district to district, from state to state. I think it, although it may feel like we are becoming more progressive as a society with regard to this, we know that individual and interpersonal interactions maybe don't reflect that a lot of times. And so it could look like that as well. I know Ryan was going to talk a little bit about suicide rates. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that one of the pieces of data that I think, especially if you're an educator or you're a parent, that you might want to take a look at is the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. They do a study across the country of LGBTQ folks, just young people, to see how they're feeling. It's interesting to see how that could be applicable in the COVID moment, because some of the key protective factors that can help make sure an LGBTQ young person feels safe and affirmed in schools are gay straight alliances. It's inclusive policies. It's making sure that there are staff who are supportive of them, but also seeing themselves in the curriculum. So those four things are extremely important protective factors. And so I think especially if you're a young person is at home, thinking about how can you incorporate those four things into their experience at home. So, they may not have a gay straight alliance of a bunch of students that they can join together to feel comfortable in community with, but is there something you could do online? You know, is there Gay Straight Alliance moving online? And for those of you who don't know, a Gay Straight Alliance, sometimes called a Genders and Sexualities Club, is a group of young people who come together to talk about these issues and how to make their school safer for folks who don't, see themselves within the binary of, straight, male or male female. So I think it's really important. The other thing, kind of going back to policy that I'll mention, that I always liked in my work when I was working with young people, is the Federal Equal Access Act. And that was signed into law in 1984 by President Ronald Reagan. And it was a way for schools to allow, for students to have religious affiliated clubs somehow within the school framework. They had to be not curricular related. But what it did was it opened up the door for other clubs who are non-curricular to be seen as equal. So for example, if you're in a school and you have a sailing club, but it has nothing to do with the curriculum, that club has to be treated on par with other clubs who are non-curricular. And so these gay straight alliances are extremely important. Sometimes they face criticism, but we know, like I mentioned before, that they're a protective factor for young LGBTQ folks and straight allied folks. So it's really important to have those. And so that's one, act, that's one law that can be very helpful for young people. But again, I think those protective factors of finding community in this time during COVID, if you can't have a GSA meeting in person, making sure that your young people are having access to inclusive materials is really, really important. You yourself as a caregiver being supportive of them is crucial. These are all things that can help. And to Ashleigh's point about suicide rates, again, it doesn't come as a surprise that it's LGBTQ young people who are most often, thinking about these issues because of the multiple stressors that they're under, much more than, straight identified young people. So they need support, they need help, and hopefully these are some things that you can help them with.
Right. So what barriers are still in place for these kids? Remember when all of a sudden transgender bathrooms became this large issue. How can adult caregivers and allies work to eliminate those barriers? What can they do? What can parents and adults do to support their kids in a way? And I don't know, either of you can answer.
Yeah, I think that there are a number of different things on many different levels. So a way that I like to think about this is on kind of like 3 different levels. So one, we have like a individual level, like things that you can do with the individual child, with your child, things that you can do in smaller systems like your family and the school, and then larger things like the community and society, legislatively, all those things. So thinking about the individual child, I think it's important to always affirm and respect your LGBTQ youth and their identities. Understanding that their identity might change over time, and that doesn't negate their how they feel. And similar to any other identity, over time that it could change depending on where we're at and what we're exposed to and those sorts of things, the language that we have access to. And so their identity kind of developing and morphing over time doesn't negate their identity and their experience. I think it's important for parents to also respect their child's privacy. Just because they came out to you doesn't mean they're ready to come out to the whole family and to their school and those sorts of things. So really honoring and respecting that and being supportive through that process. And I think once that happens, it's important for parents to protect their child. I know that oftentimes if you as a parent are accepting, we know that others might not be, but it's really important to communicate and to show that child that you will protect them at all costs, whether that be making it clear that, jokes about any gender identity or sexual orientation, making it clear that those are not tolerated in your home and your presence in any setting. it's important to immediately express, disapproval of any of those sorts of things. Requiring that family members and other people use your child's correct pronouns, those sorts of things. And so again, like working with the individual child to make sure that they feel respected and supported and affirmed, and also working to create that environment around them and contributing to that. And then lastly, at the larger level, we kind of spoke to some of the legislative pieces and connecting with organizations and those sorts of things. But I think one thing that maybe, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, but one thing that maybe we don't think about is healthcare providers and how a lot of trauma can come from medical offices and mental health professionals. And I say that as a mental health professional. So I think it's really important to seek out LGBTQ affirming healthcare providers. And that includes, doctors, dentists, mental health professionals, those sorts of things, so that children understand that they are supported all around and that their health is of the utmost importance. So yeah.
Cool. So I actually, you had asked Brian around some of the statistics, and I did want to talk about that because I think one of the things a lot of folks don't understand is not affirming a child can lead to some serious consequences. And Ryan, do you have, I mean, maybe not at your fingertips, some of the statistics around mental health issues, suicide rates for kids who are identified as LGBTQ and are not affirmed by their families?
Yeah, the suicide rates are, as we discussed, higher amongst this population because of the barriers that they often face in an environment where they are labeled as, and especially for young transgender people, you have to be male or female, and if you're not, you're something other, and you deserve ridicule. That is what they're experiencing. In the resources that we'll provide you with, and we hope that you all have a chance to take a look at the end of this, because there's a lot of resources. I guess one of the things I would mention is that, recently there was a report done, I believe by the Human Rights Campaign, that reported more than 70% reported feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. 67% reported that they had heard family members make negative comments, to Ashleigh's point about the need for family members to understand what the young person is going through and affirm them. These kinds of feelings lead to higher rates of suicide or suicidal thoughts. And so I think what I would mention here, and I do this often when I talk with adults or in caregivers of young LGBTQ folks, is we're not expecting you at the end of this session to be an LGBTQ expert, right? But what we are hoping is that with the resources that we provide you, that you'll read up and that you'll at the very least be able to get your young person to a safer place faster. And I think that's what we really want, because there's a lot of data that can go into the numbers of and statistics of suicide rates among different populations. But the long story short is that when it comes to LGBTQ folks, they're exponentially more at risk for suicidal ideation. And so I think that knowing how to work with this population, with this group of young people, is extremely important.
Great. Thank you. That's what I want to hear. So, and that actually brings something back to a quick conversation we had before we started the session. And Ashlei, you talked about affirming language and inclusivity. Can you talk about, kind of repeat what you said earlier and then kind of unpack it a little?
Yes, I'm sure thing. So there are lots of ways to exhibit inclusive language and those sorts of things. I think, again, kind of from the inside out. So thinking about the individual child, using correct pronouns, or even just providing access to education about what that means. I know that as adults, we understand the implications of using pronouns that are aligned or not aligned with the sex that we were assigned at birth. But for a child, they may not really have the words to describe, what people call me, like, I don't feel like that fits. It feels odd. It feels strange. And so having open conversations, being open to those things in a non-judgmental way can be really important. I think about even how, and thinking of just like the culture of families, and maybe this is a bit cultural as well. But I know oftentimes I might hear, a friend or something that has a newborn baby, and they'll say like, oh, he's going to break all the girls' hearts, right? And then you have your male child who's in middle school and that's questioning their sexual orientation, already hearing you assuming that this male infant is meant to be with a female person in the future. And so again, those comments that may seem pretty neutral or harmless can actually be harmful in the long run, just contributing to this culture, this idea that there's only one way to be, to experience. So using more gender neutral language instead of asking your child, do you have a girlfriend or boyfriend? Saying, is there anyone special in your life right now? Do you like anyone? Or like those sorts of things, as opposed to assigning a specific gender to it. Right. I think another important thing with regard to language, you mentioned earlier about books and things in the home. I think it's also really important to have a good variety of representation of, whether it be books, access to movies, TV shows, and things like that, that positively represent the identities of your child. And so again, those are, I think those are some of the resources that we will share, access to those sorts of things. But that's important as well. We don't want to just show things that can be harmful or just negative stereotypes about LGBTQ folks. So positive representation is really important as well. And I think, again, just creating the culture. I don't know if they can see my name here on Zoom, but I often, I try to always put my pronouns there. And again, although I identify as a cisgender woman, I think it shows just solidarity with folks who might, I guess, use different pronouns than what folks might outwardly assume. So creating that culture, I have them in my email. I share them often, when I introduce myself, I often let folks know which pronouns to use, so that if anyone in the room is trans or questioning, that they understand that that I'm not going to assume their pronouns based off of their outward appearance. So using that language can be helpful to creating this culture of inclusivity and affirming all identities.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think caught my attention earlier when we were talking was not othering people, not making them feel like they're outside or different. And I know Ryan had some strong thoughts around that as well.
Well, I was just going to say that, when you do those things that Ashlei mentioned, and it is a process, because we are all, for the most part, brought up in a very binary world. You are male or female, you like boys, you like girls, or, and that's the way it is. It's a learning process for all of us to understand that is not the way the world actually is. And I think that when you do these things where you're making sure that there is not stereotypical movies that are playing, or you're looking and you're seeking out, especially when you're going through Netflix, to try to find like some shows you can all watch, finding some that, that has an LGBTQ character in it. And these are things that may seem like small things to do, but I guarantee you, for your young LGBTQ young person that you're in charge of and you're taking care of, they notice. They may not say anything right away, but the fact that you're not asking, do you have a boyfriend or girlfriend? If you're always asking, oh, do you have someone special in your life? To Ashlei's point, I guarantee you that they recognize that, and they've made a mental note that you're someone that's safe to talk to. And that's a lifeline, and that's very important.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. Thank you. I like the lifeline piece. Do you all have, you have given us some great information and charts and contacts for all of this, and we are going to be posting it on our blog when we post the recording of this video. I'm going to turn to our magic tech elves behind the scene and ask if there are any questions we want to answer, because we're almost out of time. The tech elves are being very quiet. Anything that we haven't covered, Ashlei and Ryan, that you would like to just get in at the end of this conversation, which has been amazing, and I have so appreciated it and learned so much.
I was just going to mention that, there's so much more we could talk about, and it's such a an interesting topic. It's such a timely topic, and it's a much needed topic to discuss that would love to come back and chat more when we have more time.
Absolutely. And we're planning to do that. So this is not the last time we'll be having this conversation, I think. Ashlei, anything you have to say that you want to wrap up with?
This is just my plug for mental health services. I think that if you have a child who is struggling with their identity, and that wants a space to kind of talk about that in a safe way, and you yourself don't have the words or you're not really sure, seek out an LGBTQ affirming mental health professional. Again, work to create an environment that they feel safe in, and those little things that you do every day build up and really do show your child, your youth, that you are a safe space and that you will work to create that around them. And that goes for in person, in your home, thinking about social media, the school environment, all those sorts of things. So take care of your mental health in the best way that you can, and be working to foster that in your child as well.
Great. And we do have a question for both of you. So what advice do you have for young LGBTQIA plus kids or allies who are exposed to negative social media, news, lawmakers trying to take away rights? And first, regarding mental health, even if they live in an affirming environment, and I think, Ashlei, you just caught that with the counselor. And second, how can young people get involved and advocate for change?
So one, I think there needs to be a broader conversation on the use of social media in general. I think that it can be a useful tool. It can also be a very destructive one, especially in this moment of pandemic. So I think that's just a caveat that I put out there. I do think that it's important to be able to have a space, and again, going back to being someone that your young person feels that they can come to, being a sounding board for them to really just talk about how they feel. Sometimes just talking about it and walking through it is going to be enough to make them understand that what a legislator is saying or a politician is saying, you can help put it in context for them. And then I think it goes nicely into the second part of their question, which is, well, how can they get involved? And I think that is something that you can pivot to and say, there's something that you can do, because you're also someone who can affect change. And I think that being able to go to, the Human Rights Campaign or the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, the National Transgender Law Center, there's a variety of resources that we'll provide at the end that you can direct them to that shows that they can get involved. And going back to the point about gay straight alliances, when young people get back into their school, making sure that they have a support group that they themselves are student-led, student-created, and are leading. I think that's really important, very empowering, and I think that can help them.
Great. Thanks.
Yes, I agree. I think it's important to be a part of initiatives and communities that are working to fight these injustices. I think it can provide that sense of empowerment that Ryan's talking about. With regard to the social media piece, I think it's important to filter what we see. I know that I'm a person who uses social media, and I like to make my timeline one that makes me feel good. So I unfollow and block when I need to pages and people that aren't affirming of my identities. And that can be difficult sometimes with the news, because sometimes the news sources can be not affirming. But I choose to stay informed in more selective ways, ways that I guess, again, are aligned with my identity. So I would recommend that to LGBTQIA plus kids and allies, just being sure that the information that we receive is reflective of what we need personally. And I think with regard to like I said, the getting involved and advocating for change, it can look as simple as creating awareness, spreading awareness. It doesn't have to look like, changing a law or creating an organization at your school. Those things are great and awesome to take part in, but it can look as simple as spreading information. That's so powerful. I think awareness is the first step in any sort of change, and we can't discount the power of that. So spreading information that's helpful and useful with regard to these topics can be a very small and simple way to get involved and advocate for change.
And to Ashleigh's point, letting your young person know that the simple act of them talking to them in that moment is an act of change, and that's huge. So I love that. I want to point that out. I also would just say, as a resource that we're going to provide, is Teen Vogue has been doing some pretty amazing stuff around a variety of issues that might be a useful tool for a parent or caregiver. So to take a look at and then provide to their young person. But again, small acts of change can happen through these conversations. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, we have no other questions, and we're kind of at the end of our time. I want to thank you both again so much. Oh my gosh, the amazing conversation. Hope we will plan to keep it going in the future at some point. And I also want to mention that next month in November, we're going to be talking about Ashlei, more mental health issues as kind of the holidays, finding the supports and activities for parents, families who are not going to have the holidays they normally have, especially in this time of COVID. This is a huge stressor for everyone. So check back in with us. We have some amazing speakers coming next month. So, and it would just like the amazing speakers we just had now. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.